I always believed grief came in waves. That's what people said, as if mourning had a rhythm, a tide you could track, brace yourself against. But I never expected mine to come nightly, cold and silent, dragging with it the scent of fresh earth and something older. Something too old to name. It started a week after we buried Grandpa. At first, the dreams were just that, dreams. Memory replays, really. I'd see him in his rocking chair, that patchwork quilt on his lap, head tilted back in the sun. Or him fiddling with the broken radio in the garage, muttering about how they don't build them like they used to. Nothing unusual. It made sense I missed him. We all did. But the tone shifted quickly. Those dreams faded, and new ones took their place. I'd wake up to find him at the foot of my bed, just sitting there. Still, silent, watching. It was never violent, never dramatic. He didn't move or speak. He just sat. That somehow was worse. He looked exactly the same as the last time I saw him in his casket. Suit pressed, silver hair combed neatly back, hands folded. Except his eyes. They weren't shut like they had been at the funeral. They were open, glassy, lifeless, and locked directly on mine. The air in the room always felt colder during those dreams. Not winter cold, not even basement cold. It was different, like hospital corridors after midnight, like something seeping in through cracks that shouldn't exist. I'd wake up shivering, no matter how many blankets I'd piled on. The first few times I chalked it up to guilt. Maybe I hadn't visited him enough toward the end. Maybe I should have called more. Should have answered that last voicemail. That's what I told myself. Rationalizations are good for the soul. At least they were supposed to be. But then it happened again. And again. Always the same time. Between 2 and 3 a.m. Always the same position. Him sitting at the foot of the bed, back straight, unmoving. And those eyes, hollow like wet glass in the moonlight. Then the dreams began to evolve. In one, he started moving. Not walking, just his mouth. His jaw. It unhinged slowly, as if rusted shut and now forcing itself open. No words came out. Just a horrible, wet clicking sound. A kind of pop and grind that made my skin crawl. It didn't sound like anything human, and it went on far too long. Another night, his hand twitched. Just a single finger tapping against his thigh like he was trying to count something he didn't remember the numbers for. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less it made sense. These weren't dreams anymore. They felt like rehearsals, visitations. By the second week, I stopped mentioning it to anyone. What could I say? Hey, I think my dead grandfather is hanging out in my bedroom at night. There's a fine line between grief and delusion. I didn't want to cross it out loud. And then came the dirt. It was a Tuesday morning. I got up early, earlier than usual, because the dream had been particularly cold. I went into the hallway, groggy and achy, and almost slipped. My sock had picked up something grainy. When I turned on the light, I saw it. A small smudge of dirt on the hardwood floor. Damp, dark soil, the kind you'd find freshly turned at a gravesite. I checked my shoes by the door. Clean. I hadn't been outside since the weekend. No one else had been in my room. My window was locked. It didn't make sense, but nothing really had for a while, so I wiped it up and moved on. Until 2 days later. Another patch. This one just inside the bedroom. Right at the foot of the bed. A perfect smudge, as if someone had pressed their heel into the floor and pivoted slowly, turning to sit down. I started locking my door at night. I didn't know what good that would do, but it felt like a defense. A ritual. A line drawn. The third smudge showed up a few days later under the bed itself. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't dropped my phone and watched it skitter just out of reach. I had to get on my hands and knees to grab it, and there it was. A faint streak of dirt along the floorboards, like something had been dragged, or had crawled in. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the lights on, the covers pulled tight to my chest, and stared at the foot of the bed. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was fragile, vulnerable, human. But when the clock struck 2:48 a.m., the temperature dropped again. My breath came out in visible clouds, even with the heater on. And even though I was alone in the room, I could feel a shift in the air, a weight on the mattress, like someone had just sat down. I couldn't move, not out of fear, but because I didn't want to see him again. Didn't want to confirm what I already suspected, that he wasn't just a memory haunting my dreams, that maybe he had never really left. I stayed like that until the sun came up, listening to the old house creak and breathe and settle. When I finally found the courage to sit up, I half expected nothing to be there. But there was an impression, just the faintest dip in the mattress at the foot of the bed, right where he always sat. I didn't sleep the next night, or the one after that. I started drinking coffee at 11 p.m., reading until sunrise, pacing the room, wearing headphones to drown out every sound. But sleep always caught up to me, and when it did, so did he. There was never any blood, never any violence, just that awful presence, that smell of turned earth, that impossible cold. I tried leaving the house for a few days, crashing on a friend's couch. The dreams didn't follow me there, but as soon as I returned home, the very first night back, it was like he'd been waiting, sitting in the dark, quiet, patient. I don't know what he wants, but he keeps coming. And now, sometimes, I wake up with soil beneath my fingernails. It wasn't just the dreams anymore. They'd burrowed into my waking life, threading unease through everything I touched. I'd walk into a room and forget why I went there, hear creaks in the floorboards and feel sure they weren't for me. I caught my own reflection moving wrong, just a flicker, a hesitation too long before it followed. The mirror me always a half second behind. That's when I stopped looking in mirrors. There was a tension in the house, like the walls were holding their breath. I kept thinking of Grandpa's voice, the way he'd tell stories in the rocking chair, each tale a little darker than the last, always ending with a grin that never quite reached his eyes. I never thought much of it back then. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about the way he stared in those dreams, as if waiting for a punchline only he understood. I tried to distract myself, to pretend it was nothing. But one morning, while changing the sheets, I found clumps of soil under the fitted mattress corner, damp and dark, like the patches I'd found on the floor. And there was something else, scratches, faint but deliberate, carved into the wooden slats under the bed frame, as if someone or something had clawed at it from underneath. I traced them with my fingers, counting 8 thin grooves. They felt recent. That same day, I drove back to the cemetery. I didn't know what I expected to find. Some sort of closure, maybe. I'd only been once since the funeral, and even then, I didn't stay long. But now, there was this gnawing need to return, like a thread pulling me back to the dirt we'd buried him in. It was colder than I remembered, a brittle sort of cold that cut through layers. The wind carried a dampness with it, the smell of wet grass and old stone. I followed the familiar row of graves, great-grandparents, second cousins, names etched in fading granite. Our family plot was tucked in the far corner, a semicircle of headstones under the skeletal shade of a gnarled elm tree. Grandpa's grave sat front and center, just as it should, but something about it was off. The headstone was too new. It gleamed unnaturally clean, as if someone had scrubbed and polished it that very morning. The edges were sharp, crisp, not like the others, which had softened over time, weathered into the land. I knelt down, fingertips brushing over the engraved letters. The stone was cold, too cold, colder than the others. I noticed then that the grass around it hadn't grown back. The dirt was sunken slightly, as if the earth had collapsed inward. A man in dark overalls stood a few rows away, leaning on a rake. Groundskeeper, I assumed. I raised a hand, not expecting much, but he turned his gaze just enough to acknowledge me, and then quickly looked away. He made no move to approach, just stared off toward the woods beyond the fence. His body language said everything. He didn't want to talk. Still, before he turned to leave, I heard him murmur something, not toward me, just to the air. He said family names moved more than you'd think. I stayed by the grave long after he disappeared. Let the wind whip at my coat. Let the unease settle deeper in my bones. The sky had darkened, though I hadn't noticed clouds rolling in. I left only when the first drops of rain began to fall, but I kept my eyes on the grave the whole way to the car. That night, I dreamed again, but it wasn't like before. He was no longer sitting. In the dream, I was lying in bed, paralyzed, not from fear, but from something heavier, like my limbs were filled with concrete. And he was on the floor, not standing, crawling, dragging himself across the wood like a broken puppet, elbows bending in strange, stuttering jerks, head tilted too far back. His jaw hung slack, the mouth unhinged in a silent scream. His eyes locked on mine, just like always, but now they seemed hungry. Focused. He dragged something behind him. I couldn't see it clearly, only the scrape and shuffle of weight across the floor. The sound echoed, louder than it should have. Wet and grinding. I tried to scream, tried to move. Nothing. He reached the side of the bed. Slowly, those cold fingers curled around the mattress edge. His other hand reached for my ankle. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. But the sweat wasn't the worst of it. There was dirt, on the sheets, on my legs, under my nails. The smell of decay hung thick in the air, cloying and sour, like rotted leaves and damp moss. The kind of smell that sticks to your skin even after you shower. I tore the bedding off, yanked the mattress upright. More soil scattered across the floor in a loose semicircle. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I returned to the cemetery. I needed proof. Or maybe I just needed madness to feel like something tangible. There were no other visitors. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive stillness that fills your head with cotton. Even the birds were silent. I brought gloves and a small spade. I told myself I was only going to check, to see if the soil had settled. That's all. But my hands dug faster than I meant them to, and deeper, past the first layer of grass, then the topsoil, then the clay. I hit the coffin quicker than I thought I would. It shouldn't have been possible. I should have needed tools. The ground should have resisted more, but it gave way too easily. The lid of the coffin was wood. Oak. I remembered choosing it. The family gathered at the funeral home, pretending it mattered. Grandpa would have wanted something plain, and it was just enough to do the job. Only, there was no job being done. The lid was cracked, not shattered, just split, a long, jagged opening like pressure had built inside and pushed out. My heart pounded. I knew what I'd find before I even pried it open the rest of the way. The coffin was empty. No body, no lining, just a faint residue of black soil and something that looked like mold but didn't smell like it. It had a coppery scent, familiar but wrong, like rusting blood. The wind howled suddenly, loud and angry. I fell backward onto the dirt, heart racing. I sat there for a long time, unable to move, eyes locked on the broken coffin, trying to make sense of something that couldn't be real. But the grave was empty. Grandpa was gone, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that he hadn't been taken. He had left, and somehow he had come home. The morning after I found the coffin empty, I tried calling the cemetery. The number I'd used before was still on the business card stuck to my fridge with a magnet shaped like a pumpkin. A little joke Grandpa gave me one Halloween. He always found the oddest things funny. I stared at it for a long time before dialing. A deep part of me already knew what I was going to hear. Nothing. The call didn't even ring. Just a flat beep followed by a mechanical voice announcing the number had been disconnected. I checked the card again, typed the digits into a search engine, tried different formats, area codes, anything. Still nothing. I searched the cemetery name next. That's when the world shifted. The place was still listed, same address, same location, but it had been under new management for over 10 years. According to every directory I could find, the previous owners, the ones who handled Grandpa's burial, had retired a long time ago. The article mentioned a fire. The office burned down, and no records were recovered. But I remembered standing in that office. I remembered signing paperwork, the stale coffee smell, the scratch of the pen across the form. It wasn't a decade ago. It was months, for at most. I went back to the cemetery that night. I waited until just before midnight, when the sky was thick and low and there was a dampness in the air that clung to everything. The kind of night that feels more like something waiting than something passing. The gates were unlocked. There were no lights, just the path and the crunch of gravel underfoot. I walked the row by memory. Great Uncle Charles, Cousin Louise, then the elm tree. Then, everything dropped out of me. The headstone was different. The shape was the same carved border, same polished sheen. But the name was no longer Grandpa's. It was mine. There was no denying it. My full name etched deep into the granite. My birth date beneath it. No end date. Just a short inscription. Beloved, missed, returned. I staggered back. My vision swam. The cold I'd felt in the dreams, in the house. It was here too, radiating off the stone like dry ice. I looked around, half expecting someone to leap out and say it was a prank. But the cemetery was silent. The ground looked disturbed. Not in a messy way, but recently managed. Smoothed out, like someone had tamped the soil down carefully. Too carefully. And there was again that awful urge. Not curiosity. Something deeper. Compulsion. I came prepared this time. A flashlight. Gloves. A small shovel. I didn't remember packing them, but they were in my car. And when my hands touched the soil, it gave way too easily. The digging felt rehearsed. The same weightless collapse of the earth. The same unnatural looseness, like the land wanted to be opened. It didn't take long. Another coffin waited below, identical to the one we buried Grandpa in. I hesitated at the lid, breathing hard, ears ringing. Then I opened it. It was empty. But unlike before, there was something else. Inside the lid, carved crudely into the wood, was a phrase. "We all come back when it's our turn." I ran that night. I didn't stop until I was in my car, engine on, hands trembling against the wheel. My breath fogged the windshield despite the defroster. Back home, everything felt wrong. I kept the lights on in every room, not out of fear, but because the dark felt aware of me. It pressed in from corners, from the spaces beneath the doors. It watched. I tried to sleep. I didn't. The next morning, I noticed the first photo. It was one of the few we had from the burial. A printed copy, framed and set beside the fireplace. Grandpa's casket in the center, a few relatives gathered around it, heads bowed. Only, he wasn't there. The coffin was shut. That wasn't unusual. But in the photo, there was no one lying in it. No body at all. Just a coffin placed over the open grave. That's when I saw myself. Off to the left. Just barely in frame. Blurry, like I'd moved while the picture was taken. I wasn't there that day. I remembered clearly. I stood opposite the coffin, near the minister. But in the photo, I was standing alone, just outside the circle of mourners. The second photo was worse. This one was from my graduation. A group shot of the family, standing in the backyard. Grandpa used to be in the middle, grinning in that quiet, squinty-eyed way of his. Now he was gone. Not faded. Not blurred. Just gone. Everyone else remained. The space he'd occupied, now filled with empty lawn. I checked others. Birthdays. Holidays. Old Polaroids. He disappeared gradually. In some, he was just missing. In others, his body was still there, but his face had turned blank. Like a mannequin. One photo showed him, but out of focus entirely, like the lens refused to capture him. But in every one, my presence became sharper. I stood closer to the center. Sometimes in places I didn't remember being. In one, I was looking straight at the camera, eyes open too wide, the smile not mine. Something was shifting. It was more than memory, more than dreams. Even my reflection had begun to betray me. At first, it was subtle. A delay, just a heartbeat off. I'd move, and my reflection would hesitate. Then, catch up. Sometimes, when I passed by a mirror too quickly, I'd see myself still looking, just for a second. And worse, once or twice, it smiled when I didn't. Not a friendly smile. Not amused. Not warm. It was patient, like it knew something I didn't. Something it was waiting for me to figure out. It started with the fatigue. Not the usual tiredness that comes from stress or a lack of sleep. This was different. It clung to me like a second skin, heavy and slow. No matter how many hours I lay in bed, I woke up feeling hollow. My eyes grew dark beneath, sunken into my skull, like the skin knew something I didn't. I lost weight without trying. My skin turned pale and cool, almost gray in the wrong light. People began to ask if I was sick. I told them I was fine. The truth was harder to put into words. The house felt colder too. It was subtle at first. Bare feet against chilled floorboards, a constant draft even when the windows were closed. Then it grew worse. I layered blankets over my bed, wore socks and sweatshirts, but the cold soaked through everything. It didn't feel like the absence of heat. It felt like something deeper, like the absence of being. Then came the sleepwalking. At least, that's what I hoped it was. I started waking in strange places. Once curled in the hallway near the front door. Another time, slumped against the kitchen counter, lights off, appliances humming like they were whispering. The worst was the night I woke outside, barefoot in the backyard, standing. Just standing. It was 3:12 a.m. My nails were packed with dirt. My hand scratched and red. The air was freezing and the grass slick with dew, but I didn't feel it. I wasn't shivering. I wasn't even cold. After that, I started sleeping with the lights on. I locked the bedroom door, barricaded it once with a chair. It didn't help. Every morning, I still found traces of soil on the floor, sometimes on the sheets. Once, a dried leaf that hadn't come from any tree nearby. Another time, what looked like a tooth, too small to be human, too yellow to be new. The dreams came harder after that. Not just Grandpa anymore. There were others. Unfamiliar, yet somehow connected. Faces I couldn't place, each with eyes hollowed out or mouths sealed shut. They hovered just out of reach, watching, waiting. One whispered something I couldn't understand, but the sound made my ears bleed. I stopped pretending I was okay. One night, I went to my parents' house. I didn't plan to say anything at first. I just needed to be somewhere that wasn't mine. But something must have shown in my face. The fear, the hollow ache I couldn't hide anymore. My mother cracked first. She broke apart like she'd been holding a breath for years. Words spilled from her in fragments. Grief and guilt twisted into sentences. She said it was never supposed to happen again. That he told them it would skip a generation. That I would be safe. They didn't expect it to be me. My father didn't speak. He just stared at the floor like it might crack open and swallow him. I asked questions. They didn't answer most. But in the attic, among boxes of old books and forgotten clothes, I found the rest of the story myself. There were journals, some written in Grandpa's hand, others in older, fading script that barely held together. Notes, letters, diagrams of symbols I recognized from nowhere and everywhere at once. They hurt to look at, but I couldn't stop reading. It had always been there, passed down quietly through the bloodline. A ritual, a pact made long before our family ever reached this country. Something ancient, something that promised continuation, return, permanence. Not resurrection, not immortality, but rotation. The soul never leaves, it simply waits. And when its time comes again, it takes back the place it was owed. But only if a spot is kept ready. The spot was more than a grave. It was a place in the line, a vacancy, a vessel. One member of each generation was chosen, often unknowingly, to bear the transition. The host, they called it in one of the oldest books. The shell. That's what I was. The grave with my name wasn't a mistake. It was a promise, a placeholder. When Grandpa passed, it was an end. It was a return in waiting. His spirit, his essence, or whatever was left, needed somewhere to go. And that somewhere had been chosen years ago. Me. There were references to rituals I couldn't understand. Words and languages that twisted on the page. Descriptions of the passing. How the body readies itself. Pale skin. Sleepwalking. The urge to return to soil. The signs were all there. I had been marked long before I understood what any of it meant. One journal entry chilled me more than the rest. It spoke of a mirror, of how the soul begins its journey not by taking the body, but by taking its reflection. How? As the transition nears, the reflection becomes autonomous. Alive. How? When the reflection begins to smile on its own, the soul is nearly through. I hadn't looked in a mirror since the last time it did that. Now I knew why. Another page listed the final step. Acceptance. That's what the stone was. The grave with my name. It wasn't just a mark of death. It was consent. A spiritual contract. If I acknowledged it, if I stood before that stone and believed it was mine, the door would open, and Grandpa would walk through it. The ritual didn't require violence. It didn't need blood, just recognition, a shift in the self. The moment I saw that stone, it had already begun. The rest was just waiting for me to let go, to forget which one of us belonged in this body, to step aside. I looked at my hands, and they felt wrong, like gloves filled with someone else's fingers. Every sound in the house felt familiar in a way it shouldn't. The walls creaked differently. The floor groaned beneath me like it remembered an older weight. The spot had been made. The only thing left was to give it over. The dreams changed again. They were no longer dreams, not really. They didn't fade with daylight or break with waking. They lingered, under my skin, behind my eyes, in the stillness between heartbeats. Sleep no longer offered respite. It became visitation. At first, it was just Grandpa, as it had been since the beginning. But now he wasn't alone. They began to appear, others. Figures like silhouettes, pressed into the backdrop of my mind. Dozens at first, then hundreds, staring, standing in rows like gravestones. Their eyes were vacant, their mouths sealed or gone altogether. Some wore clothes from other times. Others bore wounds that never healed. I didn't know their names, but they felt familiar, ancestral, like echoes from a lineage too deep to track. Each night, I dreamed of standing among them, or behind them. Sometimes I couldn't tell if I was me or one of them. Their stillness was the most unnerving thing. Not a breath, not a blink, just a watching, a waiting, and always behind them Grandpa stood, unmoving, towering. I never saw him take a step, but he always drew closer. Then came the last night. I didn't remember falling asleep. I didn't remember even being in bed. All I knew was dirt, cold and dense, pressing on every side. The scent of wet earth in my nose, on my tongue. My arms were pinned awkwardly, bent beneath me. My legs numb. I wasn't in a room. I wasn't dreaming. I was underground. The realization didn't spark panic. There was no thrashing, no scream bubbling in my throat. Only stillness. A calm, dull awareness. This was the spot, and it fit. For a moment, I simply lay there, letting the weight of it settle, letting the air, what little there was, fill my chest with something that felt not like breath but memory. And when I finally moved, the dirt gave way too easily, as if it knew I was ready. I clawed up through the soil. It welcomed me, clung to my skin like a second womb. My nails cracked, my shoulders strained, but I wasn't struggling, I was rising. When my hand broke the surface, it was night. The moon, nearly full, hung low and bloated in the sky. Its light cast the cemetery in silver. I emerged fully, barefoot, clothes soaked in earth and something colder. I stood in silence, staring down at the grave. There was no stone above it. Not yet. I walked home. It took longer than I thought it would. The streets were empty, but I didn't feel alone. The shadows followed, just close enough to stay out of reach. Lights flickered. A few dogs barked once, then fell silent. The wind didn't move, but the leaves stirred anyway. When I reached my front door, it opened before I touched it. The house was dark, but I didn't need light. I knew the way. My feet didn't hesitate. I stepped inside like I'd never left. The mirror was waiting. I hadn't looked into it in days. Weeks, maybe. I'd avoided it since the last time the reflection smiled first. But now I stood in front of it and stared. There I was, or something close. The eyes were right, but deeper. The skin familiar, but slightly too tight around the cheeks. There was a tension in the jaw I didn't recognize, and a small twitch, almost a grin, that played across the lips before I moved. Then, for the briefest moment, the face changed. Just a flicker, like an overlay of someone else, older, wiser, and exhausted. A lifetime in the blink of an eye. And then it was gone. I smiled. This time we did it together. I didn't remember sleeping after that, or waking. Life became still frames. A flickering reel, missing its transitions. I ate, I moved, I spoke when spoken to. But the weight of something ancient sat behind my ribs, curling its roots deeper each day. One afternoon, a family member visited the cemetery. I didn't go with them. I only know this part from what they later said, though even that felt distant, like a memory passed down secondhand. A niece, young, curious, brought along by her parents while they tended flowers and old stones. She wandered, as children do, finding her way to the far end of the plot, past the tree, past the markers softened by weather and time. That's when she saw it. 2 stones stood now. The first bore Grandpa's name once again, exactly as it had when we buried him. The polished granite, the simple inscription. It was back, restored, as if it had never been replaced. Beside it was another, a new one, smooth, untouched, except for the name engraved deep into the stone. My name, my birth date, no end date, no flowers, just a single line below. Beloved, missed, returned. The stone was clean, the earth beneath it undisturbed. But nearby, in the distance behind the trees, a patch of soil had been freshly turned. My niece stared at the stones for a long time. Then she looked over her shoulder into the woods. She thought she saw someone watching.